From the News Channel 5 network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. There were times last year when Congress seemed rather irrelevant to our politics as the presidential campaign took center stage. Now, with what's happened in Washington this week, the House and Senate have re-emerged in the spotlight. That's especially true with the Senate debating and voting unsuccessfully several times to repeal or replace Obamacare. That broke a 7-year campaign promise from Republicans to end that program. Meanwhile, the House passed a budget bill this week that includes some funding for President Donald Trump's controversial wall across the Mexican border. And both houses approved by veto-proof majorities a sanctions bill against Russia, Iran, and North Korea that challenges presidential powers. There's no greater expert on Congress in this area, or maybe in the entire country, than Bruce Oppenheimer of Vanderbilt University, and he's our guest on Inside Politics. Bruce, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Pat, and thanks for the kind words.
Now, the Senate voted every which way to try to either get rid of Obamacare or replace it with something else. They never could get the 51 vote majority. Now, they didn't have that trouble in the past when Barack Obama was in office. What happened? They just didn't. Maybe they really didn't want to do it if it's actually going to become law.
Well, yeah, it's one thing to be in the party, not in the presidency, and another thing to have the presidency. One thing to have what you vote on in the House and Senate not become law, and another thing to know that if you vote on something, it's likely to become law, and you're in a very different position. So it's much more fragile if you're attacking versus you're going to be held accountable for what goes into law.
Now, we had this kind of vote-a-rama this week up in the Senate floor. It was like every few hours they were debating and voting up or usually down every bill that came up.
Right.
You've seen lots of times in the Senate. Have you ever seen anything quite like this, what's happened this past week?
Not quite like this. It's clear that the Republican leadership felt in the Senate that this was the best strategy for producing something that would be least vulnerable to attack and where the fewest amendments would get adopted and where you'd get an up or down vote on what you thought was doable in the end.
And there was this so-called skinny bill that was just
Right.
a few changes in Obamacare, like the personal,
Right.
like the individual mandate, the business mandate, and I think one of the taxes. That looked to be more like a placeholder, just to try to get something out of the Senate so they could go into a conference committee.
That's right. This is not a new strategy. For decades, Senate committee chairmen very often would go to the floor and say, when the House had passed a bill, just pass me a bill and give me something to take to conference and we'll work it out. So that's not really a new strategy, but that was usually when something was fairly visible or it was going to be hard for the Senate to act in some way, shape, or form. And they would entrust committee leaders to go to conference and try to work things out and then bring it back to the Senate.
There was this bizarre situation where senators were having news conferences before they voted on the skinny bill that said, this bill is a fraud, this bill is terrible, but I'm going to vote for it, and I'm going to vote for it only if the House leader, Speaker, promises that they won't try to pass this bill themselves. They were scared to death that the bill they wanted to support and pass was not one they wanted to become law.
That's something very different. You're not facing a situation, and lots of those other situations in the past, there was no idea that the House would take up the bill and just pass the Senate bill. But now you're in a situation where getting things through the Senate, even when you just need 50 votes, never mind because you didn't need cloture for this reconciliation bill where you just needed 51 votes to get something done. The problem you faced was that strategically the House might, if all other avenues were shut off, just say to the Senate, well, you won't bargain with us. We don't like what's going to come out of conference. We're just going to pass the bill you passed.
Which is the bill they didn't want to have.
Which is the bill they didn't want.
Now, clearly one of the key players in all of this was Senator John McCain. He came cross-country after being diagnosed with brain cancer to participate in the debate. He was the critical vote to get the debate started. At the end, he was the critical vote to defeat the final bill that ended the debate on making any changes to Obamacare, at least right now. I looked at it sometimes and thought I was to see if Frank Capra was right off stage or if Jimmy Stewart was somehow out on that. That was an extraordinary situation.
Yes, it was, and it does fit with the persona and the person that McCain is in some ways. One, being a warrior of sort, and second, still being a maverick and not being totally predictable on what he's going to do.
He did talk a lot about regular order of the Senate, which means a bill starts down in committee, there's amendments, there's hearings, there's markup sessions, it goes through that process. None of this happened with the Senate bill. The Senate bill started out after the House passed theirs, and the Senate said, oh, we can do better than that, and yet the entire process was completely opaque and almost behind closed doors.
Yes, not just to Democrats who were completely left out, but to most Republican senators who did not know what was going to be in each of those series of bills until they were announced. And if it had gone to conference, if they had passed something, you would have had a relatively small group of senators and a small group of House members working on it. And although there would have been a formal conference committee, it's likely that most of the dealing would have been done by the House and Senate leadership.
The Republicans in the House and the Senate promised they were going to repeal and replace Obamacare as their #1 priority. They've promised that for like the last 7 or 8 years. They're not going to be able to do that. It does not look, at least this term. What's the long-term impact on that, on the Senate, on the Republican senators and representatives, and for that matter, on the Republican Party?
Well, I think you've got to look at the trade-off. What would have been the impact if they passed something? So a lot of the people in the Senate and Republicans in the Senate were nervous about what might pass, right? And they could not agree on what would pass, and they had problems with that. So it's not that you necessarily have the best of all worlds. I think at this point that it was decided we're better off, instead of keep on fighting this, to move on to something else and make a record on something else. It was clear that if they passed any of the proposals that they were talking about in the Senate, that they would have been campaign fodder in 2018, and they're almost better off not having a bill.
But in some ways, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
It is.
Because there will be repercussions, particularly from the conservative end of the party, which is already zeroing in on some of the senators who voted no on some of the Obamacare bills.
Yes, but many of them aren't up for re-election in 2018. Right?
2020 or 2022.
That's true, yeah. And by that time, something else could happen. One interesting thing about McCain is he's not going to be running for re-election again. Even if he had been in good health, it would be unlikely that he would run for re-election again. He's 80 years old. He could take the heat on this, and he could take the heat for other senators who felt queasy about moving this process forward. So he was in a position where he's sort of immune from attacks by anybody else.
Dr. Bruce Oppenheimer, Vanderbilt University political science professor, is our guest on Inside Politics. We're talking about the dramatic events in Washington this week. Back to continue our conversation with the professor after you watch these messages.